Or good morning or good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to workshop number 3. This is a workshop about achieving positive childbirth experiences. And the aim of these workshops, what we've done in previous GLOW conferences, is to have the talks early on, and then in the workshops we try and sort of put some flesh on it and try and actually work out how you do it. So we try and make them a little bit interactive. Now, at I don't know, 3,000 miles away isn't that easy, but we shall see what we can do. And what we're hoping to do is talk around some of the practical problems around implementation research. Sally Theobald, you may have seen this morning. So Sally is a professor here at Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine and is an expert in implementation science and has been talking us through this morning. If you didn't catch the video this morning, I think it's not live at the moment yet from earlier this morning. It's not yet available, but it will be this evening. And she gives a fascinating overview of implementation science. So we've also got Indy Kaur here, who was a British consultant midwife and then went out some years ago to Hernandez Hospital in Hyderabad, or near Hyderabad, is it, Indy?
In Hyderabad.
And since then has been working on implementing safe childbirth, natural childbirth, working around medicalization of childbirth. And has inspired many. So it's fantastic to have you both with us. Sally, can I pass to you first of all? Do you want to give us a bit of an introduction as to what we're going to do this afternoon?
Sure. So hi, everyone. And what we're going to do is we're going to hear first from Indy and second from Andrew. And they are going to present some of the work, some of the research, some of the action that they've been doing within different hospital-based facilities. And we're then going to have a discussion about implementation research possibilities that come from those. So 2 different issues, 2 different contexts. And as Andrew said, this is a workshop. We want to do what we can to learn from each other, to learn across different contexts. So I'm asking everyone in our workshop to please have a pen or a pencil and some paper handy. And while you're listening to Indy, well done, Andrew and me.
Setting a good example.
While we're listening to Indy and Andrew, I want you to do 2 things. So first of all, I want you to imagine the issues that Indy's talking about in the context you're sitting in now, or in a context in which you are familiar. And we've said how implementation research is about partnership, it's about co-production, it's about implementation research teams. Think about who would you have in your implementation research team on the issue they're talking about in the context that you know. And we want you to share that. So we will see it come up on the teams. This is about networking and learning across different contexts. So please share your thoughts on who you would engage. That's your first job. Who would you partner with as a research on the issue, on the problem Indy's going to talk about, on the issue, on the problem, on the challenge Andrew's going to talk about? Who would you partner with? And number 2, we've talked a lot about implementation research, implementation science, what it is, what it means, how to do it. What advice would you give to that implementation research team? So please don't be shy. Please put your ideas down, and then we will see them pop up on the screen and we'll summarize so that we're learning.
And we should be getting it here as well, so we'll follow it.
This is about learning and networking and understanding the realities of different contexts. So we really want to hear from you.
So, okay, well, without any further ado, Indy, do you want to talk to us about breech births in Hyderabad?
Yes. So good evening, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to share. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. Thank you for inviting me to share our dedicated breech clinic. which will not only impact on the cesarean section rates, but will offer women choices about choosing a vaginal breech birth after all options have been explored. Women seeking a vaginal breech birth would value a clear, consistent, and relevant information in making an informed choice when deciding about the mode of birth. Women desire autonomy to choose vaginal breech birth and to be supported in their choice of high-quality care. I am a clinical midwife, and I would value learning from implementation research and ensuring we have the right processes in place and suggestions for improvement. So, next slide, please. Next slide. So we are all aware that breech presentations occur in at least about 3 to 5% of singleton pregnancies. However, since the publication, I think you need to go back one slide. Perfect, thank you. However, since the publication of the term breech trial in 20,000, planned cesarean had become the preferred mode of birth for women with breech presentations. However, over the past 20 years, subsequent evidence has not shown conclusively that cesarean births is safer than vaginal breech birth when certain criteria are met. Research by Dr. Sean Walker has shown what a dedicated breech clinic and team can do. She highlighted evidence from a hospital in Brussels increasing team breech births from 4.3% to 43.5% with no neonatal outcomes, no changes, and no higher neonatal admissions. Childbirth decisions in India are shaped by joint family decisions. Most pregnancy plans are discussed with the eldest in the family before making decisions. Most institutions in India do not offer external cephalic versions, and cesarean sections are the main outcome for women with breech presentation. This in hand has caused a loss of skill in birthing breech vaginally. Most breech births either happens by default and not by choice. As a result, women with breech presentations at term who desire a trial of labor often have limited choices. Next slide, please. So the clinical ability to support and enable rather than control birth processes is linked to the experience of the healthcare provider. A calm and supportive relationships in the birth environment is considered key safety factor. Many women are not supported to follow their natural instincts to be able to birth in positions of choice, and this also resonates in breech births. Physiological breech births enables women to birth in positions of their choice in upright or in all four positions. The team comprises of a dedicated trained healthcare professionals of doctors and midwives, and support is provided until birth. Next slide, please. So Fernandez Hospital is a tertiary referral center. We have 3 sites providing maternity services and a birth rate of 10,000 births. Sean Walker came to Fernandez in 2018, and her training created a buzz with the foundation. Loads of questions from doctors and midwives, and the training ignited something within the team. And they decided that they are going to try to have a breech team and to support women with physiological breech births. As we know, in India, the cesarean section rates are very high. In the state of Telangana, where we are based, cesarean section rates are the highest in the country. A dedicated breech team then was created, and by obstetric colleagues who were showing keen interest, and midwives. Training was offered, and we set up a WhatsApp group supporting breech births across the sites. The training occurred in 2018, and there were discussions on providing services. Should we support the primaps or the multips first, or should we have a couple of multips and increase our own confidence? However, our first physiological breech birth was a first-time mom who was very keen to be supported for a vaginal breech birth. Her mother herself was a breech baby, and so was she. So she knew what she wanted. Next slide, please. So we collected a retrospective case data of 68 mothers, and the time scale was between June 2019 to March 2020. Next slide, please. And the pathway is from 30 to 32 weeks. When a mother presents with breech presentation, she gets referred to the breech clinic, and we offer her spinning babies exercises. So when the baby is breech, we may do certain exercises to change the position of the baby by forward leaning inversion. We had spinning babies training from Tammy Ryan, who came from the US and trained us with regards to spinning babies. And we started spinning babies in 2018 and 2019, and we have a success rate of 68% and 65%. So after 37 weeks, if the presentations remain breech again, then we will offer them external cephalic version. Next slide, please. So we created leaflets, and Sean was very helpful and helped us with the leaflets and the templates. Next slide, please. And this was a counseling information sheet that was created. Next slide, please. And some pictures when Sean came to us. Next slide, please. And again, we audited each and every case that we did. Next slide, please. So this is the performer of the management. If you go to the next slide. 68 mothers were referred to the breech clinic between 32 to 38 weeks. All 68 were offered spinning babies exercises. And after that, at the 37th week scan, 27 were cephalic. We couldn't locate 8 nodes, but the other 33 remained breech. Next slide, please. So the 33 who remained breech, we offered them external cephalic version. 14 out of the 33 accepted for ECV and 19 declined. And out of the 33, 50% was successful and 50% were not successful. Next slide, please. So the outcomes were, out of the percentage that were not successful, we offered them detailed counseling in the antenatal clinic and informed choices. 21 of them chose to have an elective cesarean section, and 5 of them chose to have the vaginal physiological breech birth. And out of the 5, 3 had successful vaginal breech births and 2 had cesarean sections. Next slide, please. So this is the pathway of what we did. Next slide, please. And our breech interest also followed by Betty Ann Davies, a midwife from Canada that came to visit us just before the pandemic and did a training in the morning with the team. Next slide, please. This is the picture of our first physiological breech baby, and the outcomes were we had a reduction of 11% of cesarean section within this group. There was no adverse neonatal outcomes, and women's satisfaction increased. Next slide, please. So the recommendations that we would say is we would like maternity units in India to offer dedicated breech clinics, because women need to be given the autonomy of informed decision-making, and which constitutes of us healthcare providers practicing evidence-based guidelines, which will ultimately achieve a positive birth experience for women. We all agree and know that respectful maternity care is a fundamental human right and an important component of quality intrapartum care that every pregnant woman should receive. However, the effectiveness of proposed policies still remain unclear and takes autonomy away from women with regards to informed choices. So are women being given respectful, compassionate care by offering routine C-sections? And this is my plea, and I would like to hear Sally's responses on how we can use implementation research with this practice and enable women in India to make informed choices. Thank you.
interesting and thoughtful presentation. I like the way that you framed the breech team and the breech clinic in terms of informed decision making, autonomy, choice, respect, the decisions of individuals and the decisions of families being central to that. And I also really liked the thorough retrospective analysis of what happened for different women at different stages of that pathway. And to me, this is implementation research. You were, as a team, you were ignited, as you said, to make changes, right? And the idea of the WhatsApp group between the different healthcare providers to share experiences and to move ahead, I think is really exciting. So I want to make the same disclaimer I made in my keynote to say I am not clinically trained. I am not a maternal and newborn health expert. I did have breech twins and had to have a C-section, which I didn't want, but that was my personal experience. And how, in terms of moving forward, and I want our audience to have their pen and paper to hand, right? Let's say, in a context you are familiar with, if you wanted to address an issue of lack of women choice over breech birth, who would you engage in your implementation team? Please, let's start seeing some contextual responses. And what advice do you have for Indy and team as they move forward? Indy, I just had a question I wanted to understand. So you told us that there was an 11% decrease in cesarean section and there were no adverse outcomes and that women's satisfaction increased. How did you assess women's satisfaction?
We met women after the birth and went through a detailed questionnaire that we use for most mothers in Fernandez. So we obtained feedback. And women valued being listened to. And women fed back that by having a detailed counseling and giving them the pros and the cons, and we were very open and honest that we had not done a physiological breech birth. And this was our first attempt. And we shared Sean's videos on physiological breech birth and showed mothers, and this is how we may try it, and at any point, if it's difficult, then we can turn you back and try it in the traditional way. But mothers were excited. And they even gave us consent to use videos of their own breech because they could see what it was doing and helping other mothers. Initially, all of our videos were Caucasian mothers, but now from the breech mothers that we have done, we have some Indian mothers. And I think when other Indian couples see that, they think that it can be done when they see another Indian mother doing it. So the feedback has been very positive, and they keep in touch with us with photos after a year and saying she's 1 year old now.
It's a beautiful photo of you holding the first physiological breech birth baby. And just to pick up on that, we've talked in the morning about co-production, about trust, and about partnership. And again, what I really found inspiring about your example and the response you've just given is the partnership with the mothers, the women giving birth themselves, being part of that implementation research process, if you like, explaining, them staying in touch with you. It's about trust and partnership. So what are your next steps? What are you doing next to try to push forward the recommendations of breech birth clinics? What is your process and ideas for ongoing learning?
So across 3 sites, we have 2 sites that the midwives offer the breech clinics with a consultant obstetrician, and we also train trainees in Telangana. And we have also showed, when Sean came to visit us, the training was also cascaded in the public institutions. So what ideally we would like to have one day is to have vaginal breech births, not just in Fernandez, but also to the periphery, reaching the public institutions where we are doing the training. The challenges are very high because currently, even when we are training them to do vaginal breech birth in the traditional way, there's still a lot of practices that's being happening, like pulling and tugging. So we felt that we need to get the training cascaded first. So when doctors sees midwives doing the breech births, there's also some conflict that I encountered as part of my training, because the doctor was saying, wow, this midwife, she knew all the maneuvers and she did the maneuvers beautifully, but the doctor felt that no, this is the role of a doctor. So as part of the training as well, we need to also enable the culture between doctors understanding the roles of professional midwives, and a lot of times breech births are also done by default because they come presenting in breech and it's too late for anybody to do a cesarean section. Our biggest challenge is families, because the decision goes through the whole family, and if a couple may want to try it, but the family would say no because of the fear around birth.
Can I thank you, Indy? Fascinating. I've sort of been hearing about this work from peripheral, so it's nice to see actually the numbers that you've got. I think one of the fascinating things for me is that traditionally, can you be traditional about implementation research? But in theory, it should sort of come from the grassroots somehow, shouldn't it? And one of the problems we've had that there is in India, I think, is that there's a huge drive towards medicalization. And that doesn't just come from medical staff, but it seems to be very acceptable to women themselves. And people see this as it's like the Bollywood stars have their cesarean sections. Oh yes, no, I want a cesarean section. Can I have a cesarean? Oh good. And that's sort of tricky, isn't it, as implementation researchers? Because I sort of don't want to go against what women want, and yet it doesn't fit with my core beliefs. And that makes it very tricky as a researcher, because and presumably the drive for the physiological birth from cesarean section didn't actually come from the women. This wasn't the women saying, we have identified the problem that we want to give birth vaginally when we have a breech baby. Now, clearly there's a section of the community who want that, and it wasn't right that they weren't being offered that. But it's quite difficult implementing something which the majority of women don't want. How do you square those two things?
I think women's voices are changing. Women in India are beginning to understand, because there's an awareness about human rights. So there's two ends of the spectrum. India is such a diverse country. You have the wealthy, and then you have such deprivation. And the ones that are deprived would think that a cesarean section is the better option. But if you look at the public institutions and the way dehumanized care is, they want to have a cesarean section and come out as soon as possible. So there's a huge demarcation. But however, in India, women's voices are now coming up. Women are now questioning. Some sectors they're now questioning, why did they receive a cesarean section? So if it's an unindicated cesarean section, so we haven't reached the stage of breach yet. At the moment, we are doing this because we feel passionate, and we feel that we should be offering this choice as well, because it's a dying art too.
Well, I think that was sort of a problem in the past, wasn't it? That although there was a sort of a belief amongst many people that there were risks to vaginal birth which you could remove by doing a cesarean, the trouble is then that we suddenly couldn't offer a choice. So even if you said to a woman, your risk of having an adverse outcome is 5% or 1% if you have a vaginal birth, actually if they said, well, I'm happy to take that risk, I'd like to go ahead because actually I want 6 children, and to have a cesarean section at this stage has got lots of downstream problems. It was quite difficult to offer, and we find this sometimes in the UK, is that actually the skills are going, as you say, and so you sort of want to offer people the choice, but you're now steering them quite carefully towards, and you can steer in all sorts of sort of ways. I mean, this isn't intentional. You're trying to do your best, but you say, well, yeah, that's a little bit difficult, and the baby is a little bit big, and if I were you, I'd have a cesarean section. And in truth, it's partly because the skills aren't there on the ground. So actually, women don't have the choice.
I know.
So in terms of implementation research, if you were coming in as an implementation researcher, Sally, and you said, okay, this is an issue we want to study, these are pretty small numbers at the moment, aren't they? There's 68 breech babies, and in the end, 3 of them had vaginal births. Now, if you're talking about a risk of vaginal birth of 1%, actually, to see whether it's safe, you need vast numbers of clinics like this set up to try and see if you can do it safely. So I would ask, and let me be devil's advocate, is this the correct way to answer the question of whether it's safe? Isn't this a classic situation where we should be doing a cluster randomized trial with some hospitals with breech clinics, others without, and let's see the difference? It's probably better to ask that to you, Sally. It's a bit unfair. Is it a place for implementation research, a situation like this?
It's complex, isn't it? And
it certainly is.
For me, what's at the heart of this is enabling women's choice and informed consent and autonomy within the context of decision making and how that plays out in the multiple different cultures and contexts that there are within India. And being clear and honest about the opportunities and the risks of all the different outcomes and processes, and continuing to assess that and review it and build the capacity of multiple healthcare workers. I love the WhatsApp group and the learning and the doing and the capacity strengthening for all options, right? That's what we're hearing, that all options should ideally be on the table.
Yes.
And the pathway you laid out was really clear. The analysis of numbers and experiences of those women that have gone through the different C-section, physiological breech birth, capturing all of that, learning by doing, iterating, and having safety as key in that process.
Well, we hope our numbers will increase, and maybe one day we can come back and then explore this question with you, Andrew.
No, I'd love to. I mean, this I guess becomes personal, but my core belief is in choice, actually, and I've got a medical upbringing, so I tend to come from a very risk averse, and you only need to have one bad outcome, and you just say, oh, let's do cesarean for everyone. That's the temptation. So, but that's my background, and I'm very comfortable with hospitals, and I'm very comfortable with operations. Whereas for another person who wants a large family, who has seen somebody with horrible cesarean section complications, and has had ruptured uteruses as they've gone down the line and they can't get access, of course, that's a very different story. And the difficulty in this situation to me is that we are imposing the medics have tended to have the power, so we've tended to impose our views. This is the way you should do it. I'm the expert. This is the way we should do it. And actually, that doesn't really take into context the lived situation of the woman in that community. And people on the whole don't ask them, which is the sadness of the situation, I guess.
And India, I like the way you talked about different professional hierarchies and how they play out in different cultures. And when in my keynote this morning, we're talking about reflexivity and positionality and reflecting on our role. And I think that is really important. And an implementation research team, in this case, is bringing all those different perspectives together, including women that have had experiences and have taken different choice on that pathway, and continuing to assess and to iterate and to change depending on what you're finding. So,
okay, should we move on to the second presentation?
But I just want to challenge someone to give us some advice on implementation research in this area. Come on.
We've had a whole number of comments,
okay,
but actually
they're
terribly kind comments, but you're not saying actually what you should be doing. So thank you very much. Thank you for telling us, great presentation, wonderful, such a great team, and which I completely support. Thank you for sharing. The results are encouraging. It's so interesting. I've never thought of it this way. All very interesting, but you're not actually telling us what we asked you to do. Do you have your bits of paper in front of you? I suspect there's some people sitting without their bits of paper.
And if you're sitting in Nigeria or Myanmar or UK, who would you bring to the table for your implementation team anyway? Please.
It's interesting because Sean Walker, who you referred to, of course, has had a very big impact in this country. And indeed, at the Women's Hospital, we're setting up a breech clinic, which had been lost as people had moved towards cesarean sections. So, and as a whole reigniting of the question. But the question is, who do we speak to? And actually what's happened in our hospital is that we've got a couple of consultants and a consultant midwife who are keen and who are powerful, shall we say? They hold key roles and they're championing it. And that's actually what happens, the same as yourself, Indy. You need somehow that drive and enthusiasm and somebody who really believes in it to get going.
And you also need an obstetric colleague that will support the course as well, and you work multi-collaboratively because sometimes you need each other. Yeah.
Indeed, and again in Liverpool, it's a multidisciplinary team, and everyone's on board.
Okay, so let's move on.
Shall we move on? So I wanted to share a piece of research which I did many years ago. I'm hoping my slides are around. Are they, Hayden? There we go. Okay. So this is about retained placenta, which I guess is another one of those complications which thankfully doesn't happen very often, but when it does can be really quite disastrous. And this is going back now, 2001. Art got a bit interested. I was interested at the time in postpartum hemorrhage, and a number of people had retained placentas. And this seemed to be a major cause of it. And the trouble was that if you got a retained placenta in a very rural setting and you tried to get to hospital, people often died on the way. So there is a way in which you can deal with this, which has been looked at for many years, and that's injection of oxytocin into the cord, which is a little bit odd. Let me see if I can explain it. So retained placenta deaths actually are incredibly rare in the UK. We see very few of them. And when we do see them, they're at so-called placenta accreta, where the placenta has gone into the back of the uterus at the time of cesarean section. Whereas if you look, this is going back to my slides when we first started this, South Africa, one of the early confidential inquiries from there, they had 13 deaths from retained placenta. This is the 2002 report. And it was the biggest cause of retained placenta death. So whereas we'd sorted out in the UK, because if you had it, you could fairly easily get to theatre, and if there was blood, you had blood, and it wasn't nice, but it's sorted. Actually, if you're in a rural area, then it's very difficult. And so we were looking for a low-cost, simple treatment which could be done in the communities. Now, retained placenta, just because the placenta doesn't come out after the baby's been born, there's a number of different causes of it, and many people might not know this, but there's 3 different types of retained placenta, in fact. There's this one, which we call the trapped placenta, where actually it's been pushed away from the wall of the womb, but just doesn't come out through the cervix. Now, this is pretty low risk. Actually, with some controlled contraction, with pulling on the cord, this type often just comes. Or with the woman in Sheffield where I used to work, they used to blow on blow up a glove. They'd take a glove and blow into the glove, and actually that sort of pressure down on their abdomen would squeeze it out. So that's one type of it, and it maybe makes up 30–50% of retained placentas. Then there's this other nasty type, which is where there's a small area where the placenta's so-called accreta, where it's buried into the womb, and where the rest of the placenta pushes out, but there's a small part of it which is trapped inside. And that's very difficult to deal with, and really the only solution we've got is to put our hand inside and to actually pull it away. But these people are at high risk of bleeding. And then there's the type which I was particularly interested in, which make up maybe 50–70% of retained placentas, which is the so-called placenta adherens. And what you've got there is that the area around the back of the placenta hasn't contracted. So the placenta's stuck on, and as soon as you can get that area behind the placenta to contract, it detaches the placenta and out it comes. Now, our thought was that if you give oxytocin to the whole body, if you give it into the vein, then it goes everywhere. But if you could pass it up through the cord, wiggle it up through the cord into the placenta, and it's spread through the back of the placenta, it would get to this muscle behind. That would contract, it would squeeze it out. And so we set about there's a whole variety of studies. There you go, there's the uncontracted myometrium. And here's the technique that we were testing. This is my rather poor artwork here of how you can thread a catheter up the umbilical vein, inject the oxytocin into it so it spreads out through the back. And it sort of makes sense. And you think, oh, this is brilliant. If this could happen in rural areas, it would prevent women having to go to hospital and would solve the problem. So there was, at that stage, there had been a whole number of different reviews on it. And if we looked at the reviews, this again is in around 2000, they suggested that you should use it. This was an rarely used technique. And there's a thing called Cochrane Database, which some of you will know, but they put together the results of all randomized trials, and they summarize them in a graph like this. And if you look at this summary of all the randomized trials done, you can see that it seems to reduce the need for manual removal by about 10%. You think, okay, well, that's not fantastic. It doesn't deliver them all, but 10% for a low-cost technique, we'll take that. If that was me or my wife in that situation, 10% reduction in need for going to theatre. But the trials you can see are all over the place. Some of them suggesting it works. Actually, the biggest of the studies had suggested it hadn't. So we set out to do a traditional piece of randomized trial. And if people had retained placenta at 30 minutes and they had bleeding or shock, then actually we gave them oxytocin and they went for manual removal of placenta because that was too dangerous. If they weren't bleeding, we asked for their consent. And of course, if they said no, then that's fine. Then they had a manual removal of placenta. But if they were in agreement, we threaded a catheter up the cord and we injected either oxytocin 50 units, so it was a big dose we were using, or placebo. And it was either successful or failed. And so that's what we set about to do. And actually, this was, we called it the release trial, and we had 13 sites around the world, including the UK, Lahore in Pakistan, and across Uganda. And this is the traditional picture that we like to show of heroically going out to show off this new technique. This is me going up to northern Uganda. This is in Lahore, teaching people how to do the technique. And it was relatively straightforward to do. And we recruited the majority of our women from the UK, but a decent number from Uganda and some from Pakistan. And what did we find? the number needing manual removal of placenta, whether they had oxytocin or placebo, so actually the person injecting didn't know which one it was, actually it was identical. Whether you injected just water, which was the placebo, or whether you gave the oxytocin, absolutely no difference. And I was mortified, and I wanted to go in with a silver bullet to be the all-conquering hero and to sort out a way of saving lives, and actually it didn't really do the job at all. What's interesting though is that the number needing manual removal of placenta actually is only 60% in either arm, and which is interesting because it meant that in the half an hour between injecting it and going for manual removal, 40% of the placentas had come out on their own. And if you were just doing it with oxytocin, you'd say, well, this is brilliant. We were just about to do a manual removal. Oh, that's 100%, 40% success rate. This is brilliant. Let's all implement it. But actually, when you find you give a placebo, it's identical. So we had to conclude that umbilical oxytocin had no role in the management of retained placenta, and we published it. And in fact, the new guidelines, we continue to update this review, and now shows that it's not quite statistically significant, and you can look it up on the Cochrane review. So there's a question here. So what would we have done if we'd done this as an implementation research? I guess a couple of questions is trying to get my head around implementation research. Actually, was I asking the right question? And also, did we need to really have evidence that it's really effective before we start to implement it? Would this have been too early because we really weren't sure the trial suggested it was better? In which case, do we always need a randomized trial before we go on to implementation research? And if we had done it as implementation research, we wouldn't have had the control group. We would have just had the 40% success rate, and we would have all been dancing around and saying how wonderful we were and implementing this globally, when actually it really probably wasn't that. It was waiting half an hour rather than jumping in. So to me, this raises all sorts of sort of interesting questions. The one thing that Sally and I were talking earlier, and one rather strange thing happened in this, was that one of the women died in the study. And we'd recruited 570, and there was one death in it, and it's a tragic story. And in fact, the woman had come into hospital with a retained placenta, but there was only a junior doctor there to deal with it. Couldn't get the placenta out. She started bleeding. They then said, well, the babies are already out, but how am I going to get this placenta out? I'll try and do like a cesarean to get the placenta out. They were desperate. They couldn't call any seniors. The senior's phone wasn't going through, and she died on the operating table. I know the poor doctor was trying to do their best, but actually the whole system, there was no blood to give her. There weren't senior people available, and it raised the question really of, well, were we actually asking the right question to start with? Because actually we wouldn't have stopped that problem, because the problem was one of placenta accreta. So I don't know what you make of all this, Sally, because this is our traditional RCT model. Is there any way in which do you think we can convert this to a sort of implementation research, or are we just asking the wrong question?
I think where we'd start with implementation research is we start with what is the problem. And the problem here is retained placenta, correct?
Yeah.
And the implications of that for the tragic reality of maternal mortality in some cases, and then complications and morbidity. So that's the problem. So the challenge in that case would be to bring together a team and discuss the different issues that contribute to that problem. situation you've just told us about maternal death, that was around what, not having support at that particular moment?
No senior support, no skilled support. Yeah.
So how?
No blood available. I don't think there was good anaesthetic cover either. It was a very medical problem, and there just wasn't the skills or the support there to deal with it.
And the magic bullet that you showed had limited impact, would have not made any difference in that situation.
No, it wouldn't have done. It was a slightly different. It was an unusual type of retained placenta where a lot of the placenta is stuck up in the inside.
So, how do you strengthen the health system in that particular context to deal with that particular issue? I mean, Indy, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this situation. This must be something that you've seen within Hyderabad, retained placenta. What would your advice be in terms of moving forward to address issues here?
So it's very interesting, Andrew, because one of my trainees in her reflections shared that there was a retained placenta where she was practicing in the health center, and she escalated it to the medical officer, and the medical officer asked her to give oxytocin. And she said to me, but I did not give it because I wasn't trained how to do. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So then we discussed reflections that this was absolutely the right thing to do, because if you've not been trained to do something, and the mother went on to have a physiological birth in placenta within 16 minutes, and there was no increased bleeding, and everything was fine. So there was two things here with regards to birthing the placenta, because we know that they can have an adverse effect like the lady that you have just described, but it's very tricky. Because that's something that we don't train them. So when you shared your presentation, it just brought back that for me. And the midwife did absolutely the right thing, because she wasn't trained how to do it. And we are talking to them about the scope of practice.
Yeah, no, I think it's not a difficult technique, but equally people shouldn't be doing techniques that they can't do. I think one of the interesting things. Sorry, had you finished, Indy?
Yes. Yeah.
I think one of the looking back on it, this was a solution that I was sort of imposing from the outside, and it was interesting. I went particularly to Uganda to study this technique, because as an academic in this country, I'd discovered this gap in knowledge and thought, aha, this is my chance for a randomized trial, a funding, a publication, some research. This was, and I'm doing good, of course, at the same time, but actually at no time did I go to Uganda, where the problem was, to say, talk to me about retained placentas. What's the problem there? Do you think it's a problem? What is the underlying issue? I think at that stage I'd say, well, if you had a solution which could help in 100% of people, that'd be great. But actually, a 10% reduction is probably more important at that stage, to get some good blood supplies going, make sure that people have got petrol in the in the ambulance to get from a peripheral unit to a place where it could be manually removed if she's bleeding. And I think I would hear that now, whereas in those days I was, I was fixated on providing the magic bullet, and that's often a problem, I think.
So I think obviously there is room and role and need for technological innovation, right? And there is role and room and need for randomized controlled trials and pragmatic trials. And I like the discussion this morning from Jane around the pragmatic trial and embedding process evaluation, implementation, learning alongside that. And in that RCT that you described, there's always opportunities for implementation learning and understanding. And you would have then also, if you'd only had the intervention, you would have documented how the 30-minute wait had its own outcome of the placenta coming out anyway. So that is the learning of implementation research and process evaluation, capturing the detail in the real life setting to understand what it actually means. And I think it's a really good place to start in terms of what is the problem in that context? What are the challenges in that context? Bringing together teams that can bring their different perspectives to the table. And we've talked about choice and trust and autonomy and informed consent of everyone involved being so critical as well. And we've talked about, in both of the cases, the retained placenta and the breech clinics, you've both talked about what's happened since or what's happening now, ongoing learning within the realities of specific health systems. And health systems change and problems change. You've also talked about training, capacity strengthening, cascading knowledge. And also you've both discussed about multidisciplinary teams, bringing different perspectives to bear to these issues. So that's some of the learning for me. And also the learning across contexts. You've shown us, Andrew, from yours, the different UK, Pakistan, Uganda. Indy, you've talked about different sites in Hyderabad as well as you move forward and learning and scaling up from those 3 different sites. And these are challenging questions, aren't they?
There's some interesting points coming in through the feed. Thank you very much to those who are...
Yeah, can you summarise them for us?
I'm not sure I can summarise.
Come on, give it a shot.
In fact, we've only got a few minutes, but... so the people, I think, for the retained placenta study, they would include, well, maybe it works for both, actually, obstetricians, midwives, a layperson from the women who've had a successful breech delivery. Okay, so it's breech delivery, a layperson to represent families, somebody held highly in the community. Somebody else says we need to ensure that community opinion shapers are included to create a demand which disrupts the professional hierarchies. And consider getting the radio DJs in on the discussion. In low and middle income countries, they have a huge reach and often instigate very lively debates, and that sometimes end up on parliamentary agendas. Interesting.
Yeah, from the community DJ to the parliamentary agenda. I like that. And that's about community engagement.
Yeah.
Developing strategies to discuss with diverse constituencies, get their views in.
I'm seeing that our time is over, I'm afraid. This time goes too quickly, really, doesn't it? But our time is over. We've got just 5 minutes now until the final session of the day, which is Pecha style presentations. If you haven't seen those before, this is one of the things I've been really looking forward to today, actually. People get 20 seconds with 20 slides. So each presentation is only 8 minutes. So it's a brief presentation, just with very rapid slides. And there's 4 of those coming up in about 5 minutes. In the meantime, go and get yourself a drink, go and have a brief pause. Nazim seems to keep cropping up. People are telling us all over the app who's our musician. There's even yoga on the site here. There's posters you can go and review, and the soapbox talks. So thank you very much. Thank you, Indy, for taking your time. It must be quite late now. What, you about 9:30, something like that?
It's about 8:30.
8:30. Sorry, my mental GMT clock isn't quite right. But thank you very much for joining us this evening.
Thank you,
Sally.
Thank you, Sally. Thank you, Andrew.
We can continue the debate online. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye.